Sound film on Australian speech and elocution. The connection between speech, conversation, and character was made explicit in the rules of Australian etiquette. The character of a person is revealed by his conversation as much as any quality he possesses. Elocution is the art of speech and eloquence, and it was a distinctive marker of social and class status and an indicator of national identity in Australia in the 19th century. Of course, Australia was colonised in 1788. By the 1840s, the native-born were increasingly thinking of themselves as Australian. Customs were still British. A little less broad than is usual today, although it might have been slower, more deliberate, more self-consciously correct than that of its English counterparts. Throughout the 19th century, Aboriginal borrowings became common by the 1830s. Various American expressions on the goldfields became part of Australian vocabulary as well. The Australian voice was not a homogeneous entity. It was made up of many different voices, all together, all to a greater or lesser extent, positioned in a complex and telling hierarchy that ranged from the working class to elite, from colonial to metropole. Elocution was an art that was a required discipline and learning. Elocution required training. It was a great mistake to think that elocution could be easily picked up by anyone at any time. While it seems a long time ago now, the late 1920s was a monumental time in the shift of Australian English. Sound film, a medium developed in the late 1890s by American Thomas Edison, had kick-started the industry through the invention of the kinetophone. Although Edison's kinetophone made its debut in 1895 in the Queensland mining town of Charters Towers, sound film didn't gain traction until the following decades, with the first commercial sound film, Jazz the Singer, produced by Warner Brothers, 6th of October 1927. A year after its American release, Jazz the Singer was the first talkie to be screened in Australia. Sound films were colloquially referred to as talkies, which is an allusion to the sound made by voice actors that was recorded and then synced with the film's visual component. Being a global milestone in film production, the premiere of the world's first sound film on the 29th of December 1928 at the Lyceum Theatre in Sydney signified the start of American media influence in Australia. Although, as previously mentioned, there were Americans on the First Fleet and an influx of migrants from the Californian Rangers and the Revolver Brigade during Australia's gold rush in the 1850s. This pales into comparison to the monopoly American media would have on the Australian public in the coming decades. The Jazz Singer was in theatres until June 1929. British sound films were also released like Rookery Nook in 1930, but now British influence had a competition against American influence, at least in Australia. At the expense of being exposed to the American accent, the Australian people gravitated to them like mozzies drawn to a light supper. Concerns arose over the coming years with the South Australian variant of the Advertiser, saying on the 1st of March 1930, our friend and critic, Mr. H.L. Mencken, has been telling us in the English press that we are adopting American language. It began long before the war. It began with free circulation of American books and magazines in England. We owe a great debt to America, as great as that other debt in a different and harder currency, for bringing us back to our Anglo-Saxon. It has nothing to do with film captions. The dead hand of the Latinate in the late 18th century lain heavy upon us too long when America, a rustic English-speaking community, presented us with fresh, lively, pleasant English expressions like up against it and nothing to it. On the 22nd of October, my great-great-grandfather, Lance Fuller, gave an address on the transition periods in English poetry in the Blue Tea Room on Rowe Street, Sydney. In 1930, there was a teachers' conference in Melbourne. The Commonwealth and state ministers tried to exercise a stricter censorship of talking film, attack the American talking pictures on the grounds they were exercising a harmful influence on Australian children. The Australian heart that Australians are beginning to resent the influence by the vulgarities of the American lower orders as portrayed by too many important American films. Affirming of British Australia 1930, The Sun. Our speech is purely Australian, providing that it is not a debasement. There is no cause for regret. Rather, it is a reason for pride. Mimicry is a confession of inferiority. Speech should come from a genuine local connection with culture. We desire that our national speech be cultivated as a genuine expression thought by people whose opportunity for culture exceptional. As a distinctive Australian quality, so much the better. There's nothing worse than when Australians try to imitate the English, forgetting that he is an Australian and ought to have individuality enough to be true to his type. He becomes a weak imitator from pure affectation. There is sometimes the sorry spectacle of returned Australian trying to pass off a poor imitation of an Oxford drawl, bespattering his conversation with dreadfully, beautifully, awfully gorgeous tags that are plainly imported. The Argus editorial, now The Age, described it as the strident nasal utterances of many American film actresses may not fall harshly upon the American ear, but Australians would be staggered by the idea that any strange girl be addressed by a breezy young man as cutie, honey, or sweetie. Instruction classes of the 1950s and 60s, children were taught to speak properly and enunciate. Extracurricular activities such as Scottish dancing and piano lessons resembled middle-class post-war Australia. It was a civilising project of the British Empire. Etiquette manuals, schools, speech days and eloquence in public life, and distributed in Melbourne, New York and London. Victorian elocution and public speaker manuals written by the clergy for University of Educated Men. Elocution became a part of these efforts to standardise the pronunciation, which was seen as an integral part of standardising the written word. Crystal observes that between 1780 and 1800, there were more English grammar books published than in the entire previous 2 centuries, provided a prescriptive approach to grammar as it quickly defined what was correct and incorrect usage. There was also the English Imperial Project. Speech was not adopted in uniform ways. Australia and America inherited the language of the mother country, but very quickly adopted different accents, vocabulary, and pronunciation. Particularly in Australia, these changes occurred because of all the different sorts of people across the UK with all distinct accents changing their speech in such a way that anyone, regardless of their background, could understand each other. To an extent, this did exist in the UK as well.
The Northern Territory in the ACT come along a few years later.
This to be considered stronger than the other. Then the north wind blew as hard as he could. But the more he blew, the more closely did the traveller fold his cloak around him.
It could also be argued that the cultivated Australian accent is thought to be an artificial accent like Hollywood mid-Atlantic accent, where elite coastal Australians imitated British RP, and it was seen as of being of more high status. The main quality of the Australian accent is the intonation. RP tends to go down, while cultivated Australian English has a rising tone.
Sit down, you're too old to be standing. Thank you, Mr. Day-Lewis, from you. It exacerbates this honour to it, and it blows it right out of the ballpark. Thank you so much to the Academy. As random and as subjective as this award is, it means a great deal in a year of yet again, extraordinary performances by women. Amy Adams, everything you do, but your performance in American Hustle blew my mind.